Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to all of our community a close friend now from the great state of Texas, not originally, however, Professor Sheena Greitens. She's at the University of Texas, an associate professor at the LBJ School, as well as a faculty fellow with the Clements Center for National Security and a distinguished scholar with the Strauss Center for International Security Law. Now, most of you will know I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. working in the think tank community. Unless you think for just a second that Sheena is just an academic from the wilds of the American frontier, she's also got a lot of other affiliations in which I've, over the last decade, had a chance to work with her. She's the senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an adjunct fellow with the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for China Studies at Harvard University, where she received her PhD, and a member of the Digital Freedom Forum at the Center for New American Security. So I think you pretty much checked off almost every major foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C., Sheena. I would note that there's a horrible dearth of Australian think tanks on that list, and so we're going to have to work on that. This will be our first step in that process. But
I'd be delighted to make it out your way. That would be terrific.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I am also going to note that for the rest of us slackers and underachievers, in addition to all the tremendous research, writing, and academic and policy work that Sheena has done, she did take time to serve as the First Lady of the great state of Missouri. She built up an amazing Korean studies program at the University of Missouri before moving to Texas, and has been a champion in other areas. I'm always deeply impressed with people who have time in their life to do things other than kind of policy work. But Sheena has been a tremendous champion on foster care, adoption, child abuse prevention. And so I really appreciate the social work that extends beyond just the field of policy lines. Sheena, can we start off by talking about a book, which again, for you is probably old news, but will be new news to many in Western Australia and in the region more broadly. You wrote an award-winning book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Again, won multiple awards. I'm wondering if you might just kind of start with a quick, short primer on the book itself, its focus, and then I want to use that as a prism to talk about several recent developments in our region.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book really emerged out of my doctoral dissertation. And at the time that I was going through graduate school, a lot of the work about dictatorship was about, why authoritarian regimes had parliaments and why they held elections and why they might have courts. And in some cases, protect the rule of law for, say, the economic realm to attract foreign investment. And that struck me as interesting. But I was also really frustrated because it struck me that that was leaving out something really important about authoritarian regimes and non-democracy. And that was the people who could come and knock on your door at night and take you away to a political prison and keep you there for a very long time, or torture you, or in some cases, execute their own citizens. And so it struck me that this literature had kind of gotten, off from what we think of as the intuitive heart of dictatorship and non-democracy, which is the use of violence rather than consent, and rule by violence rather than consent. And so I was really interested in, why it is that some dictatorships go through periods where they're much more violent. And then there are other times where they seem to rely on a toolkit that's much more about surveillance and intimidation and monitoring. And there's just this repertoire of repressive techniques. And I wanted to understand when particular leaders or regimes tried to apply these different tools that struck me as really fundamental to being a dictatorship. And so I ended up writing about three American allies during the Cold War: Taiwan, which was a single-party regime under the Kuomintang, South Korea and its period of military rule, and the Philippines under Marcos, which was sort of a personalist, very focused on Marcos himself as an individual, personalist dictatorship. And so, I ended up really arguing that dictators have have to worry about a couple of different things. They have to worry about popular revolution, but they also have to worry that the people who they put in power to manage the population and society could turn against them and could overthrow them. And so they do a lot of things to kind of mess around with and control their coercive forces that actually end up making those forces much more violent toward the population. And so violence is actually a byproduct of some of these fears of a coup and of removal by the military or the security apparatus. And so that was it was a really interesting project because I got to go into the Cold War history of Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, look at where the US alliance was effective in trying to protect human rights or push for democratization, and where it hadn't worked very well for the United States to try to do that. And also just spend some time really, living in each of these countries and getting to know their history, their politics. And so it was a great experience. And also really helpful context to have. Now I spend a lot more time looking at China and North Korea as contemporary examples, but understanding kind of the inner workings of these historical cases was really helpful. And so it was a great project. It was a lot of work. I was glad when it was done.
I can imagine that. Although I'm just reflecting on the three countries that you focused on: Taiwan, Korea, and the Philippines. Obviously, like the United States or even Australia and any democracy in the world, they have their own challenges. But those are three countries now which are largely considered kind of part of the democratic movement over the period of the last 30 years or so. The interesting thing is that had you written your book in 1992, it might have been an interesting history, right? A look back on, this Francis Fukuyama era, the end of history, that we're all marching towards kind of this open, free, liberal, market-based, democratic kind of Star Trek society. And yet, if we look at it in 2021, it seems to be almost a forward-looking book. There's some fundamental challenges about, how dictators are using coercive elements and using this. So I'm wondering if you'd talk a little bit about what you just alluded to. Where are the areas that are most interesting to you to apply the prism of what you learned in your research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, we live in an age where we're seeing some countries that were making progress toward democratization lose ground, whether that's via a military seizure of power in Myanmar, in Burma, or whether we're seeing, sort of a more creeping erosion of democratic norms. We've seen downgrades of liberal democracy in both India and the Philippines over the course of the last several years, but in a more gradual, incremental process. And so, one of the things that I have been really interested in, especially in the past year, that I imagine might be interesting to your audience and community, it really has to do with the effect of the pandemic on surveillance and health surveillance in particular. That was a big part of this book project, was when regimes choose to use surveillance, how populations respond to it. And so I've been really interested in thinking about China's experience with surveillance and the pandemic. China was the epicenter of the outbreak, and China had pursued a pre-existing surveillance project that is just sort of staggering in its scale and complexity, and was doing that well before the outbreak of COVID-19. In terms of, investing a ton of money in surveillance technology, building these data integration platforms on the back end so that all of this information that got collected could actually be used for analysis and policing and social control. And the pandemic gave them a public health imperative to sort of further strengthen and augment those systems. And so, China has kind of offered its experience with coronavirus as a model for the rest of the world. But, there are some pretty big concerns with applying Chinese-style surveillance and social control tools to the rest of the international system. And so one of the things that's been interesting is to see places like South Korea and Taiwan, which have had experience with infectious disease outbreaks and SARS and MERS, but which also have this experience of having intense surveillance during their recent authoritarian past, really debate and say, no, we want to put some limits on the way that surveillance is used. We're going to, have the legislature debate this. We're going to pass a law. We're going to really limit what emergency powers we're going to give somebody in a health crisis. And we're going to really limit the amount of data that we collect on people's health, and then make sure it gets deleted later. So we limit it in scope and time. And to me, a lot of that, thinking about what I had written about or what I had studied in the process of writing this book was a really helpful backdrop for understanding why both Taiwan and South Korea were willing to use some surveillance technology to manage the pandemic, but that there was also a really strong undercurrent and very lively debate in both societies about making sure that wasn't overused, and that ultimately the tools that were used were proportional and very limited, and arrived at in a way that was compatible with the democratic process. And so I thought that was a really interesting lesson with that authoritarian backdrop in history in mind.
Now, the broader global debate about whether authoritarian societies have responded to the pandemic better or not tends to have missed countries like those that you focused on, right? They tend to want to look at what's happened in Europe, Italy, or the United States or the UK, and versus China, and don't realize there's an awful lot of nuance in our region in particular. Obviously, the Australia, New Zealand experience is one thing, but also Korea, Taiwan. Having said that, it does seem to me that as sensitive as the issue of surveillance may be, there is another step change beyond that to the much more coercive elements, the disappearing people, the secret police, the forcible lockdown, not in the case of WA where we locked down to keep people out, but in the case of Wuhan to keep people in. I'm kind of curious as if you would kind of address some of the more violent aspects or the more secret police aspects of developments in the region. Obviously, you've long focused on Korea. North Korea's got to be a concern. We've got ongoing issues in Burma, and China obviously is a major prism of your work as well.
Yeah, and especially in China, like you said, I think China's pandemic response in Wuhan, but also in other parts of China, really relied heavily on public security and on the tools that the CCP had developed for social control. There's this phrase, prevent and control, which is in the name of China's CDC, but has actually become one of the kind of catchphrases that Xi Jinping uses to talk about for maintaining social stability and protecting political security in China. And I think that shows you that the fact that the phrase overlaps tells you something about how securitized China's response to the pandemic was in terms of controlling mobility and making sure people didn't leave their home and really aggressively monitoring them using some of these tools. I think the other big development that I've been watching and that the world has been watching is what's happened in Xinjiang. Where China has, around the spring of 2017, held a Central National Security Commission meeting in Beijing. And when Chen Chuanguo, the party secretary, got back to the region from that meeting in Beijing, he held these mass sort of paramilitary rallies that look like something out of a Star Wars set, honestly. And then, the orders go out that month to start building this really massive network of detention facilities. There had been, smaller scale re-education and detention in Xinjiang before that, but it really expanded massively in the spring of 2017. And I think it's this idea that has taken hold under Xi Jinping that you really have to prevent anything from emerging at all. It's extraordinarily preventive, and the metaphor is one of immunization, right? So to get back to this overlap between public health and public security, the metaphor is immunization, which sounds great, right? It sounds curative, and this is the state is like a benign, medical personnel who's there to help you. But I think the metaphor of immunization also points out that you're by definition, quote unquote, treating people who've shown no sign of a political virus, right? You immunize people before they get sick or before they are exposed. And so that metaphor itself, which is one that comes from Chinese writings and speeches, actually tells us about who's being targeted and the fact that people are being targeted at a point when they haven't done anything to deserve it. And so the human rights issues and the scale of abuses in Xinjiang, I think, is also, it's also been really important to think about this whole idea of surveillance and prevention, but in China's case, then throwing this detention and re-education into that goal, and that whole security project has been, just really chilling to watch, frankly.
No, I like your phrasing, the securitization of what is essentially a medical response, and then taking that medical response and flipping it around and using that for securitization. It's an interesting kind of...
It's a very weird and troubling feedback loop, honestly.
Well, staying on that issue, obviously, it's probably a little bit more difficult for you to travel and research or study in China. We both spent a lot of time there on the ground. I saw a tweet that you put out a couple of weeks ago where you were talking about the repression of academics in China as being rare but real, and then you went on to say, and increasingly not rare. I'm curious as to, given your approach to this from an academic side, but also understanding policy implications, tell me about your relationship with your colleagues, your counterparts in the Chinese think tank academic community, because all these issues that we're discussing or concerned about have in the past been of concern to them too.
Yeah, and this is a really odd time to be trying to have those conversations because of the constraints imposed by the pandemic. But there's also, this self-reinforcing issue that the pandemic has contributed to an even further, intensification of, I don't know exactly what the right word, intensification of tension in the U.S.-China relationship, which has spilled over to academic and think tank exchange. And so it's hard to have conversations with people in a virtual forum because people are cautious about what they say. And the conversations are even, to the extent that we're able to have them, are more restricted. One of the things that we've seen is that China has issued directions at very senior levels of the party state about strengthening party leadership on university campuses, which means making sure that party discipline is followed and that the campus and professors on the campus adhere to politically correct lines. And yeah, there's some spectrum of opinions that are tolerated, but that spectrum has narrowed. And, so what was behind the tweet is that a colleague, Rory Truex, who's at Princeton and a fantastic scholar, and I did a survey in 2018 where we asked academics who worked on China how often they had encountered some form of repression, whether it was being denied a visa or being invited for tea by the local public security apparatus, or, not being able to access materials in an archive, or, a whole range of being warned that their research was sensitive, having a friend or a colleague warned. And we found that, people were systematically running into repression, but it was still at that point relatively infrequent. And then right around the time we wrote that, I think there was things started to change. For one thing, you had the detention of the two Michaels, whose trials were this past week or week and a half in China. And
so for our listeners, this is Michael Spavor and Michael Koberg, two Canadians, which are held by China largely in retaliation for the Canadians detaining the heiress to the Huawei company, right?
Right. Yes. Thank you. I should have clarified that. And these are folks who were researchers and people who worked at think tanks. And so I think the concern is that that's a relatively new development. So is things like bringing lawsuits in a Chinese court. Which has happened to an academic in Europe, Adrian Zenz, who's written a lot about Xinjiang. And most recently, we've seen rounds of sanctions applied not only in the United States, but also to academic or research institutions in Europe, in the UK, and Canada, and the United States. And so all of this is a pretty direct targeting of academic work that is critical of China, and in particular, the use of legal tools seems to me to be a new tactic, and it makes the boundaries much more explicit. Before, there used to be a little bit of uncertainty about what the boundaries were, and you might, be able to, navigate around some areas that were sensitive a little bit better. And now we're seeing a pretty clear statement: this is what's out of bounds, and if you cross it, here's the potential penalty. So the deterrent factor, I think, has gotten a lot more explicit. And it just strikes me that China is approaching academic freedom and institutions of higher ed and think tanks in a very different way than it did even 5 or so years ago. So when I said, it's increasingly less rare, it's something, I think, again, the political space is closing and the likelihood of repression is going up.
Well, two things you said that I find particularly interesting. One is that they are increasingly reaching out beyond Chinese borders, right? We have a wonderful young scholar here in Australia named Vicky Xu, came out of University of Western Australia, but now works for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And she and her colleagues there had done some really groundbreaking research on Xinjiang. And just yesterday,
yeah, their work is really path-breaking.
Incredible. But she just yesterday outlined in this long Twitter thread all that she has been subjected to over the course of the last 8 months. Fake videos of her, deep dive into her own personal life, and attacks, cyber and otherwise, out of China. It's quite a stark thing for somebody outside of China, or in the past they wouldn't reach to. The other thing you mentioned, which I found really interesting because I hadn't thought about it, is obviously the particular challenges of that discourse over Zoom. And I remember, my first engagement in China in the early 90s, Chinese delegations that came out, this was shortly after Tiananmen, would say the exact same line to a T per person. A delegation of 10 was the same as the delegation was 1. There was no differences of approach or opinion. But over the course of 20 odd years, China just continued to get more and more open, more and more free. And I'm sure that you've experienced this in your own life, where your interlocutors would have internal debates within China, and they would disagree with other scholars, and they would be quite open and candid within bounds, obviously, of criticizing the Chinese government. But there has been this remarkable reversal of that, where, one, it's difficult for Chinese scholars to come out. And since they can't come out, they're left with this the single pathway of being online where everything is recorded. And so that really does stifle the discussion and dialogue that I think is so key in that process.
In the United States, we have a number of institutions that have a lot of Chinese students. And so when those students went home during the pandemic, over the summer, then we had the Hong Kong National Security Law that was passed, which had pretty significant extraterritorial jurisdiction, right? It did not limit itself to saying this action is problematic if you're a Chinese citizen or if you're inside the PRC's boundaries. It had very, sort of broad claims to jurisdiction outside of China. And so, for a lot of universities who were trying to teach Chinese students, maybe a month and a half or 2 months after that, the national security law passed, when the fall semester started here, there were real conversations with my colleagues about, what are our obligations to students who might be taking this course from China? And what do we advise people? What are the ethical responsibilities that we have as teachers and as scholars in terms of balancing student safety with needing to maintain a free, free academic environment, because that's what we do here in American universities. It was very difficult, and Zoom makes it more complicated. You're absolutely right.
Let me ask you a question that's perhaps unfair, and that I wouldn't pose to kind of a normal academic. But given the fact that you've had kind of policy experience, plus you've been in the executive mansion, there seems to me to be a real tension between, on the one hand, being concerned, as you just articulated, about Chinese students studying in the United States or Australia, about the ethnic Chinese American community, or in our case, ethnic Chinese Australian community, or Asian community more broadly. And we've seen, in the case of the US, this wave of kind of anti-Asian racism and hatred, which is longstanding. It's not a new thing, but it particularly seems to have been fomented in this era of angst and uncertainty around COVID by, the China flu, the Wuhan flu, this demonization of all things China, China, China. And on the other hand, there are actually some real serious things that you just outlined that are being done by China in Xinjiang against their own citizens, their own secrecy around the Wuhan. How do you handle that tension between not wanting to foment anti-Chinese sentiments and racism that will spill over into communities in our democratic societies, and yet not ignoring the very real issues that are taking place on the broader international stage?
Yeah, I think it's a terrific and a really important question to grapple with, in part because we've seen what the consequences have been here in the United States, whether it was, the recent violence in Atlanta or a spate of other incidents that I feel like are in the news, and security camera footage that we are seeing far too often these days. And you probably remember I have a Korean American sister who was adopted from Korea when we were both quite small, and so this is something I really actively worry about members of my family, and as well as colleagues and friends at the university, and just also fellow members of the university community and fellow American citizens who are of Asian descent. So I think this is a really serious thing to grapple with, and I think we have to understand, particularly as it relates to China. So first of all, the answer just has to be that that kind of racism and violence is unacceptable, full stop. And I think at a policy level, we also have to think really carefully about the fact that people who are of Chinese origin or who still have family in China may be more likely to be targets of Chinese repression and coercion. There's this phrase that we use to describe, how the party state works on demobilizing people inside China at a local level, called relational repression. And we saw this when we looked at our academic survey results too, where it was actually more common not to necessarily threaten the person that the authorities found concerning themselves. They would call a colleague, they would call a friend, they would call somebody's parents who remained in China, and warn them, and in some cases threaten people. And so, that's a really difficult problem. And I think understanding that people who, live in and love the United States often still have family or people that they love and care about who are in China, and who may be targeted or pressured or coerced, and that's a really serious issue. To me, the ethical responsibility then is to try to really reach out to and support people. And yeah, there are these serious issues around, the use of academic mechanisms and talent programs for illicit tech transfer and IPR theft and all of these issues. I mean, all of those are very, very serious. But I think we also, we've already seen an emphasis on that, and I would like to see it paired with an understanding that often, the Chinese party state will use this tactic of relational repression across international borders, and that we need to come up with better ways of dealing with that, for people who we, want to keep in the United States, who've become citizens, who deserve then, the rights and protection that come with American citizenship. And that's a very American-focused answer. I think there's an Australian version of that as well. I don't mean to be sort of narrowly, parochially American in my answer, but thinking about it here, I would then apply a similar process probably to the Chinese community in Australia.
No, there are many bonds between Australia and the United States, and one of them is that we're both multi-ethnic societies, and increasingly so in both cases, and both wrestling with this understanding of what it means to be an Australian, what it means to be an American. And every time you think you've answered that question, that we are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, open democratic society, you get, this tension that pushes back occasionally in not productive ways. And so I understand that completely. I'll focus a little bit on Taiwan, if I could. I mean, what a fascinating country that you spent a lot of time in, did a lot of research in. Tremendous story of its democratization. Obviously, in a really unique circumstance, and being so close to the People's Republic of China. For a while, it seemed that the tensions between the mainland and the People's Republic, or the Republic of China, had gone down. But in recent years, Chinese pressure probably handed the current president Tsai Ing-wen re-election just by putting a lot of pressure from the mainland on her. What's happened in Hong Kong has really put a stake through the heart of any notions of a one country, two systems dream that they might have had. And so it seems that Taiwan is in a uniquely and increasingly precarious position. That there seems to be growing recognition of that in the United States as well. I'm curious as to your view as to how we should understand where Taiwan is today and what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I would agree with that characterization that it is increasingly precarious. Obviously what we've seen is a rapid growth in Chinese military power, and that a lot of that growth and development has been directed at acquiring the assets to handle a confrontation in Taiwan and make it much harder for Taiwan to defend itself, or for the United States to come to the aid of Taiwan and to help Taiwan defend itself. And so, just that very fact, right, this shifting military balance, makes it very hard to find the right balance of, how do you deter the mainland from taking aggressive action, and how do you deal with tactics that sort of, that are pressure or coercion, such as these, the rate of flights that China has been sending, that were requiring Taiwan to scramble fighters, and to figure out, how to respond. And I saw just the other day that Taiwan had actually changed its protocol because it said we're wasting too many resources trying to follow our current response plan. Every time China is doing this, that they're wearing us down just with the tempo of operations that they can sustain. And so this is a really, really difficult challenge. And I actually think Taiwan made a good decision in terms of adapting its response and its decisions about how it was going to handle these flights that are increasingly common. But I think fundamentally the political problem remains. And so I think you've seen a really active debate, and when I say debate, it's not a particularly partisan one. Most of the resolutions on Taiwan that go forward tend to have bipartisan support. They tend to have bipartisan co-sponsors, but a lot of it is searching for, how do you try to protect Taiwan's right to, as a friend and colleague of mine, Maggie Lewis, wrote this piece recently talking about what does Taiwan want? And she says it just wants to be Taiwan, which I thought was a great way of explaining Taiwan, especially for anybody who's been there, who's seen, the vibrant society and democracy and culture and interacted with people there. It is a great place, and it's worth preserving. And so, I think there's right now what you're seeing in Washington, D.C. is just a really active, searching for and trying to go through different steps that the United States and allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific could take to try to make sure that Taiwan gets to stay Taiwan. I don't know if that quite answers your question.
It does. And again, you can tell the quality of the conversation is I'm asking questions that I genuinely want the ansers to. And
You're asking all the hard ones. I don't know if I have good answers.
I
can't solve this problem. If it was easy to solve, I think somebody would have figured it out by now.
No, that's precisely it. But I'm going to tie this one back to your book. So it's a little bit more relevant directly than just solve world peace kind of questions. I'm curious about the role of international pressure, sanctions, the international community and the use of coercive measures in countries, and in particular, again, you focused on three countries where there was some impact of that. You can think to Korea and the role of the Olympics in that process. You can think to Taiwan, obviously, the Philippines, people power, et cetera. But if you look today at what happened in Hong Kong, I mean, part of it was just the way politics were completely, on their back in both the United States and UK at that time. But, really coercive measures in Hong Kong with hardly a peep from, the Western world, if you will. Right now, I just saw a report this morning that the number of deaths in Myanmar has exceeded 500. And throughout the region, you're going to find many other examples of the things that you've written about taking place, and yet some fundamental questions about, well, what do we do? What is the response of the international community? So to tie it back to your expertise, what role, what responsibility does the international community have in cases like we're seeing today?
I think it's a layered response, and I think ultimately the core responsibility that we have is to preserve and protect the quality of the democratic institutions that we have and that we share with allies and partners. And unfortunately, we've seen recently some places where that itself has been under strain. And we've had to think about how do we protect and defend American democracy, whether it's concerns about foreign influence and in the cybersecurity of elections. A couple of years ago, UT hosted Chris Krebs, who ran CISA, the CISA, the body that's in charge of election cybersecurity for the United States government. And there's been real concern about, how do we maintain the integrity of democracy, including in the United States. And so I think that's kind of the first line of defense, and it's frankly, it's sometimes easy to get complacent about some of those things, right? But one of the things that I think I learned from writing this book is that if you actually look at the broad sweep of human history, authoritarianism is the norm, not democracy. Democracy really has to be actively defended and protected and nurtured for it to thrive. And so I think that's a really important lesson. But then I also think we really have to think carefully about what our responsibilities are to allies and partners, because one of the things that we've seen in particular in Asia, and Australia knows this really, really well, is that China's ability to bring economic pressure to bear and economic coercion to bear to try to get countries to toe a certain political line is a really powerful, that's a really powerful force for a country to try to withstand. Whether it's, Taiwan with the pineapple stuff recently, or South Korea and the economic costs that South Korea paid when it decided to go through with the THAAD deployment. Australia's own history. This is something partners in Europe have grappled with. You think about Norway after the 2010, I think it was 2010 Nobel Prize ceremony. I think we're overdue for a conversation among democracies about how are we not just going to sort of withstand that pressure ourselves, but how are we going to help each other? And how are we going to help other democracies when that pressure gets brought to bear? And I don't think we have a very good track record of that so far. So it strikes me that that's a really important area that we need to really talk about and think about. And I haven't heard enough good ideas yet to be happy with the way we've approached that problem.
Well, agreed. Look, I've been greedy with time. We're already over our allotted time, but I wonder if I could just wrap up two final questions and be parochial and bring it back to Australia. Sure. There was a very high profile early meeting between the new Biden administration and China in Alaska. I welcome your view on that, how you see that, looking at it from UT. And then secondly, you've already alluded to the economic pressure that China has put upon Australia. There are some people that suggest we shouldn't ever use the word punishment, but we should use the word attack, because punishment implies a subservient position and Australia having done something wrong. But I'm curious both as to big picture Australia, US, post Alaska, how you viewed that exchange and what we should take from that. and then your understanding of Australia and its particular position with China right now.
Yeah, the Anchorage meeting was very interesting. Obviously, some of the things that were said were criticisms that each side had uttered before. We had heard complaints about, race relations in the United States from the Chinese side in the human rights reports that they issue every year. And similarly, the United States had said things that were very critical about Xinjiang and Hong Kong and things like that. But to see those things front and center in the opening few minutes of that public bilateral exchange was new and different. And I guess, one of the things that I took away from that was, really that there has been a shift in Chinese diplomacy toward a much more aggressive campaign to promote China's talking points, whether it's on, coronavirus or Xinjiang and the use of forced labor and the Chinese pushback on that issue, or the tweet that I saw earlier this week where a Chinese diplomat referred to Justin Trudeau as boy and a spendthrift and a running dog of the United States, which was a real Maoist era throwback and actually made me think of some of North Korea's insults toward foreign leaders. Honestly, it struck me as like both Maoist and almost North Korean in its tone. So first was, that there really has been that shift in China's diplomacy. And I actually think it is backfiring. There's some evidence that I've seen from, academic papers and research projects that suggest that the attempt to, just deny that there's any real problem in Xinjiang has led to an increase in research on Xinjiang, because then people are like, well, I don't buy that. There's a debate. Let me go find out what's going on. And so you get more and more things that are about repression in Xinjiang, which is not, that's counterproductive from China's perspective, but entirely predictable. And then, on the US side, I actually, I wasn't sure how much continuity there would be between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Biden administration ran, being very, very critical of the Trump administration on a lot of things. But China has been an area where there's been, I would say, just for me personally sitting in Texas, a little bit of a surprising degree of continuity. Not that I expected that, they would go in and pick back up where Vice President Biden left off in 2016. It's a very different world with the pandemic, with the detention camps in Xinjiang, and the finding that there are crimes against humanity and genocide there, which the Biden administration's upheld. So it wasn't that I expected them to sort of just zip back to 2016, but I thought we might see a few specific policy changes that on tech policy and things like that actually haven't occurred. And so I think one of the things that I really took away from it was that there's actually a fairly high, degree of continuity. And that means that there's really a hardened bipartisan consensus on some of the areas where China's behavior is problematic. And that means that that's really a feature of the US-China relationship that's here to stay. Now, so that's kind of depressing, right? That's not great news for the world. But I guess, the thing alongside that I saw that was really heartening was, the focus on the Quad and the decision to provide, to use the Quad to provide something that the region really needs, which is vaccines and access to health, and to use that as a mechanism to really start solving real governance challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And so I actually think, one of the things that I am excited about or optimistic about is, what the United States and Australia will be working on, and the role that hopefully our two countries will be playing in trying to shape things in the Indo-Pacific where we can in a positive way. So in terms of, sort of where Australia sits, obviously that's not to downplay any of the challenges in Australia's relationship with China, right? I think as we've talked about, there are lots of those challenges. But I guess, the one the one bright spot that I saw, and the thing that seems like a reason for optimism for me is, what came out of the Quad meeting and what that probably says for the both the U.S.-Australia bilateral relationship going forward, but also the way that I think it could be really productively embedded in regional efforts. And I hope very much that optimism is borne out, and that I don't feel foolish for having, expressed that optimism a year from now.
Well, I'll join you in that. I have that shared optimism. I think people who haven't served in or around government don't appreciate how remarkable it was that, 9 weeks into a new administration, that the U.S. came together with enthusiastic participation from India and Japan and Australia, not only had a leaders meeting, but put out a joint statement with an attachment, a PDF attachment of the areas they're going to work together on vaccines and on climate change and in technology. And then did a joint op-ed in the Washington Post. What a remarkable thing to be done so early, and it speaks of the level of shared interest in those four countries, and if nothing else, that gives us shared optimism, shall we say.
Well, I teach writing and communication, and I was actually joking about the process, the drafting process and the wordsmithing involved in that op-ed. And I'm not sure I would have wanted to staff that process. But just to think about how you get to a text that everyone can sign off on for an op-ed like that was pretty amazing to think about.
Well, I heard we had a conference yesterday, and there's a professor here at UWA, Ben Riley, who made an observation, which I'll credit him for. He says the Quad is quite unique in that it is not an alliance, but a grouping that is truly trans-civilizational, right? To get Japan with Japanese culture, and India with Indian culture, and the United States and Australia with clear differences, but it's more similar shared culture, to come together on something like that and put it in an op-ed is a pretty remarkable development. So look, Sheena, I've taken up almost a full hour of your time. The conversation could easily go on. I've only gotten through a third of the questions I wanted to ask you. And of note that the fact that you and I have worked quite a bit together on Korea over the years, and we managed to go through this entire hour without getting to North Korea. But I know,
and there's a lot there to think about. It's probably a whole separate conversation.
Yeah, well, it is, and my strategy is to reserve Korea to entice you to come down here and join us for a workshop talking about Korea as we go forward. So,
Sounds
thank you so much.
I look forward to it.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And for those of you in the Perth US Asia Center community who are interested, you can follow Sheena on Twitter. You can follow her research and writing. She's got her own website, and you'll find her at the University of Texas as well. But as you can tell from our conversation, tremendous insights on the region, and ones that unfortunately are more and more important going forward. So Sheena, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me.